I'll just start. Technically speaking, that would be possible. Practically speaking, I don't think it makes much sense because they're kind of connected to each other. They interact better in their specific implementations. I think the main difference between the two is the specific set of variables that make something a super standard or standard, transaction that are more geared towards their specific implementations. The idea of choosing between dsproof and txrelay and the implementation of the priorities still makes a lot of sense to separate in implementation anyway. You can choose to not do any superstandard if you want and still do the txrelay. But then, as imaginary username mentioned, non-upgraded SPV wallets will not get the benefit from this protection.
I absolutely think we need to combine the proposals to some degree, whatever comes out. Specific things about the, for example, there's things that are not in the NP proposal, such as expirations, not dealt with at all. It needs to be dealt with. Specific things I like about the other proposal are the standard replacing non-standard idea. I love that idea. So, and then the whole, we have different views on fees. The Respend Relay says fees is not part of the solution. The other one says it is. I think what to do about fees could wind up mixing and matching.
The fees is an interesting topic because we know that fees is a concept really introduced by Core in a way that moves it towards a specific economic model that really wasn't part of the initial Bitcoin. And what we've been discussing in the last 2 years, I think, is to replace the idea of fees with something slightly more complicated, because the original Bitcoin said that the age of a transaction, or an input specifically, is much more important. The specific code in the original Satoshi client says that if you have a transaction input that is very old, time-wise, and your transaction is 0 fee, that basically is seen as a very high-quality transaction anyway. So where I'm hoping we're going to is not have fees specifically in any of these situations, but we're going to a situation where we, for instance, count the amount of inputs versus outputs. So you allow more transactions to be used with lower fees because they empty out the UTXO set. That's just an example.
So it sounds like fees were used early on to effectively penalize transactions, but not to refuse their being committed, right? I think today fees are being used a lot for spam control, and I was wondering, especially in things like non-priority transactions, and of course both proposals are sending more data over the wire, right? So how does the ability to create spam and spam multipliers negatively affect these proposals?
At this point, the SI proposal, I feel, has the DOS attack vectors very well locked down because you limit two things. You limit the number of messages that can be relayed as alerts against a transaction, and you limit the size. So while earlier there was a rate limiter in the old code that was in XT to begin with, we've upgraded that in the implementation and the spec, so I think that it's totally controlled as far as the DOS vector.
So there's 2 points here. First of all, I think that if we allow transactions, whole transactions to be relayed, you will send more data. The ability to send first a small transaction as a simple example and then send a 100K transaction and suddenly you obligate the network for its self-protection to send the 100K transaction as well becomes an issue. And at the same time, the whole concept of transactions are bigger than proofs. And also means that if you have one original transaction and 15 respends, I'm kind of wondering how many of those respends are being broadcast as well. Whereas in just one, okay, that's good. And whereas in the double spend proof concept, the message being sent is extremely small. It refuses to send anything, broadcast or propagate anything that doesn't actually have a transaction in the mempool to match it. So you can't just create hundreds of proofs. And last, if just like in the relay, apparently, when there is more than one respend, then you will not relay the second one. So I think the spamming itself is mitigated quite well because it is directly connected to the amount of transactions that a node allows into its mempool.
Tom, do you have a question?
Sorry, I have one question about it because it's obvious that then relaying takes more data, but from the perspective of a spammer, is it easier to spam by creating all these respends, or can it just as well create different transactions? I mean, does transaction relay somehow increase the abilities of a spammer over what it already can do with ordinary transactions?
Cost.
The relay proposal increases it roughly by a factor of 2 because you can relay one extra transaction that's not going to get mined. Okay. So that's the risk. In the past, there was some amplification, but not now. I just want to respond to some of the things Tom said. 100K respend is not possible under the SI proposal because it's not super standard. Only a 2K transaction is super standard. 99. Well, we're talking about this proposal, though. So it's not a weakness of my proposal that you can relay a large alert that large. It is, however, a weakness of your proposal that you try to protect a transaction that large. I concede that the proofs are smaller than relaying a transaction because the real proof is the transaction. It's the thing the double spender signed that incriminates him. You can redact. The question is, what can you redact? Thanks to the sig hash algorithm in BCH, we can, which not in Bitcoin, in BCH, we can redact things from it and have it remain a proof. So the proposal redacts all the inputs that aren't involved, which is a good idea and makes it smaller. It also redacts all the outputs. As I said earlier, I think that's a bad idea because it reduces the addressability of the alert. Yeah, that's
one thing just to say that I find fascinating is there's a huge commonality here, which is that no one is arguing anymore to not relay some form of alert, right? So effectively, you could imagine that the DS proof is kind of like a more efficient relay of the full transaction. And one thing that I found interesting about that is, people have made the observation that DS proofs aren't available for all transaction types. So perhaps if the more efficient version isn't available, we could fall back to the ultimate proof, which is just to relay the transaction. Imaginary username, do you have a question?
I just want to point out because there was a discussion about the spam potential, which is right now, as in first seen, is directly tied to the fees that you pay per transaction. But if you are doing a double spend transaction relay, then there is this potential to increase the network load much larger than the fee that is going to get confirmed. So you can relay a very small transaction that is 192 bytes and pay the appropriate Satoshi fees, 192, and then and then you put out a much, much larger transaction, and that would have to be relayed. So, yeah.
Much. And your question is that correct? Or
No. I just want to point out that that is one spam amplification vector.
Yeah. So if it's 192 versus the respend could be 2K and the
Or
SI,
50K.
And also the proof would, well, I guess the proof would be smaller. But yeah, the fees, if you bake fees into the standard, which could just also easily be done with any super standard TX relay, that's an option. It's just we have to make a trade-off between making the standard brittle or making it adaptive to the network.
So here's a question for Tom Harding. It's kind of a little bit related. You had talked about the respend gap, right, and how important it was to minimize that. Wouldn't the DS proof minimize that respend gap because the proof will travel a lot faster for non-trivially sized transactions?
To the extent that it's smaller, I suppose it would. Yeah, if it redacts the other unseen inputs, it would be slightly faster.
You're supposed to argue with me about this.
Is that a problem?
The 2K is really small.
No, I don't.
Yeah, 2K is very small.
We're talking about a very small diff there. Just
Well, okay, so if we say 2K, we're assuming that we also deploy super standard, right? So I think we need to sort of imagine these as, separate possibilities that we deploy. Like what we have today is just respend, right? And now do we move to super standard or not?
I would say to verify the proof, you have to do, well, I guess you have to verify the signatures either way and do the hashing either way. Yeah, so it's just the size.
Chris mentioned earlier yesterday that it would be nice for us to, to come to consensus on double spend proof or double spend relay. What do we want to put our effort towards? But I'm wondering, so we already have TX relay in BU and XT. Do we really need to pick? Can we not just implement both and kind of see what happens? Is it really so bad if we have both live on the network?
Can I respond to that? The talk from you, Peter, a couple of days ago implied that the way to get better double spends to actually land at the miners was to use the relaying of transactions. And I think it was funny because the first comments on Reddit was, hey, it's interesting to see that this relaying of the transaction is actually the cause of the double spends. If you were to turn it off, it would be very interesting to know if your test comes out differently. And I think that's the biggest issue I have with double spend relay. It hurts the network. It has two major effects. The first one being a transaction that would currently use, or before BU implemented this, be completely rejected on the first seen rule, now suddenly does propagate through the network. And this is okay-ish for normal nodes because they most likely have a mempool, see all the transactions. For SPV nodes, this is disastrous though, because if you have a fast respend where the second transaction is towards an SPV user, then there is no way for that SPV user to actually figure out it is a respend because it never gets the first transaction because the first transaction is filtered by its Bloom filters. It wasn't to him, so he doesn't get it. And therefore, the relay will hurt SPV users exponentially, and that is supposed to be 99% of the users.
So I'd like to respond to that if I can. And I think it brings up an interesting topic, which I think we're skirting around, but I'd like to make it very clear, which is that it seems like in a lot of cases, the presence of a respend needs to effectively mean that both transactions have to take on the qualities or the priorities of the other. And in this case, a solution to the problem that you propose would be, well, even if one transaction doesn't fit the Bloom filter, it gets relayed to the SPV node anyway, due to the presence of the the double spend transaction. And I think we see that actually in a lot of places, because we're talking about, like, one of the important parts of the DS proof and the transaction relay is to relay these entities at high priority, right? And Tom, Xander, you were talking about what's great about the DS proof is that it's a separate channel from the transaction relay. And I took that to mean effectively a separate high priority, will not be thrown out, censored, thrown out, just channel, right? Is that a good assessment of the reasons?
I need to respond to the other thing.
Can I first respond to his little mistake? Yeah.
So when you mentioned the SPV nodes being at risk because of relaying respends, they may not have seen the original one. The code out there doesn't do that. That was identified as a risk, and so it doesn't do that. That was an interim. For now, we're not relaying respends to SPV nodes because we wanted to fix that problem. But also, the correct thing to do, as Andrew said, is to make sure before you send the proof of whatever kind, you send the original transaction, make sure they have it. The suggestion that relaying the respend is dangerous because it's bad and it may be mined is not correct on a bunch of levels. First of all, as security, it's security through obscurity, and that's not something that we want to rely on. I mentioned earlier the double spender himself could send it to hundreds of nodes. Everyone needs to be prepared for receiving it, and the fact that we're doing it now and it hasn't caused a ton of problems means that generally, because it's even on the BTC network, at one time, XT was about 20% of nodes on the BTC network, so almost every node was getting all the respends with the normal connection counts, and it never caused a problem. They didn't have RBF back then. I think I remember Imaginary Username himself did a test to check whether the mining of respends was increased by relaying them, and I believe he found that it didn't.
It was...
or was the opposite?
So that simulation, it addresses a specific thing, which is if it increases the chance of a TX2 getting to the miner first. In a upside down situation, and the finding is that relaying double spend does not increase that by any significant amount.
So that was your partner that found that.
It did not, however, address the question of whether a ill-minded miner would who gets both would have a higher chance of oh, I got TX2, I might as well mine TX2 first. That was not addressed for variety of reasons, but if such a miner exists, then the answer is probably yes. So yeah, it's yes.
That wasn't the argument I was making. The argument I was making is that it goes to SPV users, and you said that that's not the case because the BU software doesn't send it to SPV miners, SPV clients. That doesn't mean it doesn't reach SPV clients. Because if I send the bad transaction to a different node, that one can itself send it to an SPV node as well. It doesn't have to come
only if it sees it first, because they don't relay respends.
Only if it sees it first, or if it's not standard. You basically come back to the original current setup, where your transaction is not going to be seen by the majority of nodes if you have a lower fee, for instance, and therefore you still have all the opportunities, because suddenly, instead of you needing to contact hundreds of nodes like you yourself suggested, suddenly you just have to send it to one BU node and they will contact hundreds of nodes for you.
I just want to say on a higher level, the idea that the idea that one transaction is contraband and the other one is good, the idea that because you got something 1 millisecond later than another one, that it mustn't be relayed, and other nodes mustn't be able to draw their own conclusions about whether it's and users can't draw their own conclusions about what the gap was, isn't a strong way of approaching it. The better way to do it is to make the network transparent to both of them, and then at the point of consumption, the decision has to be made whether there's really a problem there or not. Identifying one as good or bad, you could be seeing them easily 50% of the time for simultaneously transmitted. You're making the wrong decision. It's not possible to do that.
So, I would like to rebound on two things that you said. The first one is that really, like, not relaying the second transaction is security by obscurity, and we shouldn't rely on that. And I agree 100%. But on the other end, that doesn't mean that, like, I don't think that's an argument for relaying security. And let me take like a metaphor to try to explain that idea. I have a lock on, on the door on my house, right? Because I do not rely on everybody being nice and not breaking in. That doesn't mean that the person that breaks in is not a giant douchebag, and that doesn't mean that we should consider that behavior as normal. So I don't think that's a very strong argument for double spam. However, you made another one that I think is usually quite misunderstood. But there is no notion of this is the real transaction and this is the double spend, right? Because we are on a distributed network, and all notions of time or what event happened or did not happen is inherently subjective. Each node is going to have its own, and there is literally no way to ensure that, like, this is why we need Bitcoin in the first place. It's for all the nodes to converge toward a common state. Before that, there is literally no common state that exists, and there is no common state that can exist. And so as a result, the idea that there would be an original transaction and there would be that double spend, and we need to block that double spend, it's not wrong. It's actually completely meaningless, right? It cannot be right or wrong. It doesn't make any sense to begin with. So yeah, that's pretty much the idea I wanted to emphasize.
Completely agreed.
Can I just respond to this very comment? I also tend to agree with you, and obviously we need blocks and proof of work to order transactions, but I mean, of course, we have this kind of gray area where we say, like, okay, first thing safe is like, I mean, the whole idea of having this boundary of, like, let's say, okay, after 3 seconds of not seeing anything, it's safe, is because we do some ordering and assume that the total network, even though on a micro scale it does not have like an ordering of transactions that's consistent between nodes, on a scale of like 10 seconds, it does have an ordering, right? If you don't have a transaction, then you're sure it's a double spend after it comes after that.
I agree with that.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to say that I do agree that security by obscurity is, never the best pattern. But also we have to be very clear that when we give full knowledge to a miner of a transaction twice, we are giving them a choice to choose between two things where it's completely ambiguous as to the intended recipient or what transaction is a valid transaction. They're both valid transactions. They don't really have any way to choose. So the debate really is anytime you see two, you know that you have no idea to know whether and what's actually going to get mined on the network, and that this is a case where the merchant needs to consider it a bad case for the merchant. So they're either going to need to refund payment, or they're going to need to just acknowledge that something has gone wrong. And that is absolutely the requirement. So I think that trying to minimize the case where a miner could be bribed, it's not necessarily security by obscurity. It's really just making sure we don't make it easier for them. Just handing them the keys and saying, oh, hey, here's a way for you to cheat the network and just get some extra money. Any profit-driven miner, we don't know what they're going to do. We can't assume that the miners are going to behave well. So this is really just a risk analysis of, do we want to give them all the information so that they can try to be profitable, or are we going to try to just give them a proof that something's gone wrong so that the merchant has been notified that this thing has gone wrong? Mm-hmm. To me, the main difference between the double spend proof and the TX relay is not whether it provides the notification. They both provide the notification. They both give the data that's needed. What is the difference, I think, is the technical effort to implement the specific solution. So double spend proofs, we're talking about using a different channel to be able to send those proofs using an env message that is new, and it requires some updates in order for software to support double spend proofs today, where TX relay does not require any real integration changes inside of the ecosystem. And I think that's the main point. They both do work. One has a slightly higher attack vector in that the miner can choose to grab the higher priority transaction and could lead to that. But at the same time, the merchant is going to get notified and they're going to reject the payment anyway. So it's kind of inconsequential at the end of the day. But it's the integration complexity that I'd like to try to focus on, and I really haven't heard much of a discussion about that part.
Okay, well, to respond to your concern, the experiment you would want to do, ideally, is to have a world with only double spend proofs, or attempt to have only double spend proofs, and then have one that has free relay, and see if fewer adverse confirms happen in one or the other. I don't know if we can do that. We can't do that experiment because we can't lock down the relay of TX2. Even if we don't have relay nodes, the attacker can do it. The node restarts, or even the wallet, I think in some scenarios could relay a conflict, because maybe or maybe not. But we do have experimental data that Peter presented, and that's available. You can just scroll through the respends on doublespend.cache and see what does it seem like, when do surprising adverse TX2 confirms happen, and it's when they were relayed very close together. The time is the thing that makes it happen. The fee is not the thing that's currently making it happen overall. And today, it's not because they can't get it. They can get it.
So I like to address what Justus said. I mean, I think there's one big difference, and that I think is not addressable with the TX relay, is that the big transaction case, right? Like, you will get a faster relay with the double spend proof, and I don't see how you can get around that.
When you say big transaction,
yeah, like a 100K transaction versus like a 100K transaction versus a 1K transaction.
Well, SI says 2K is the max, so you wouldn't try that.
What do you do with a 100K respend? Do you just assume it's not going to be a problem?
Not covered. Like,
it would not be zero conf, right?
If you are going to use a 100-key transaction, you won't get instant transactions.
So
you are going to wait for 10 minutes if you want to buy.
But he's asking about the respend is 100K.
So the way I originally read the spec, the super standard relay and the super standard replacement was actually tied together, and I believe that part was addressed by the fact that the 2K is going to replace 100K at all times. That's how I read it. So, I don't know if that is correct, but.
Yeah, because it's defined to be not part of the protected class, and so if it does lodge itself at a miner, it would get dislodged by.
I just like to try really quickly. I like that idea. Then, like, it makes sense. Like, to say, okay, like, we only have like up to 2K or something for these transactions, and they get replaced. But then we open this other kind of worms that you have to attack the first seen saves rule to replace it with your replaced by 2K super standard, right? So it seems to me like this is like a path you could go, but it has the hurdle of more changes that can break existing existing software.
That's the same with the TX relay, with the DS proof. I mean, the DS proof, we must also assume that miners will. Sorry. With DS proof, we must also assume, and I think that's a point that Tom Harling also made, we must assume that these miners will get both transactions. So you always have that problem. You have to. These are two different problems to solve.
This is not correct. The miners are not responsible for creating the proof. Any node can do that.
No, but if we're just going to relay, not going to relay transactions, but going to relay the proofs, then an attacker is still going to attempt to get their double spend transactions to all the miners. So we still must have the policy of how to handle this second transaction.
Well, but being aware of them is already so being aware of them is already good for the merchant, right? And I think that the problem is that with the TX relay, you might get to the point where the merchant is not aware of the big transaction.
This goes but together with my talk an hour ago, where a double spend proof is not meant to have any influence on the miners on which transactions to mine. I completely agree with the statements made earlier that the right transaction is a judgment call and can't be made by the system. Miners can decide however they want. I don't mind. The point of double spend proofs is to let the merchants know that something happened, so they can lift it out of the system and take responsibility. So if I'm standing on the street and you pay me something and you double spend behind my back, that I know that, hey, I shouldn't give you that article you just bought from me. That's the point. So it's nothing more. And while I have the mic, I want to respond to two things that basically are the same point. It's about the way that we deploy this. Because there's one rather large problem with the relaying, because the solution suggested for an SPV wallet to get the knowledge of a transaction is for a node to change its behavior. Where if I have the scenario, my attacker sends a transaction to himself, and then a couple of seconds later he sends a transaction to the merchant. The problem with an SPV wallet is it would never see the first transaction. Therefore, with the relay, it would never actually notice there was a problem. So the solution to that was suggested. The node changes behavior. It sends both transactions to the SPV wallet. This assumes that SPV wallet is upgraded and will actually detect this. Say, hey, there's a transaction that's not for me. Currently, that means that all SPV wallets ignore it. And if you do this, if you make the network change this for a while until all SPV wallets have been upgraded and patched, you will actually create a bigger problem, because as before, now that transaction that is currently not being relayed at all actually reaches the SPV wallet. So you're actually creating a problem, and this is the deployment issue. If we could do a snap replace and everybody's devices are going to be upgraded today, then there is something to be said. But there is a huge problem with rolling out the relay for SPV wallets right now, and we can't fix that in any way. Whereas you can.
So I omitted from the description of the how to, when we start doing that, how to address that. We did identify that you would need, the SPV wallet will request respends. Nothing will be relayed to the wallet unless it requests it. And changes to the node and changes to the SPV wallet are required under both proposals. And I think the magnitude of the changes is similar. Also, I want to return to the...
Wait. Tom Z, do you believe that the magnitude is similar as well?
The changes needed to the SPV wallet in the double spend proofs are currently, and this was actually also mentioned in the presentation from Imaginary Username, the changes needed are essentially that nobody gets hurt because they get a message they don't understand, and therefore they don't get the notification. And so where I think a wallet has the reason to upgrade to get notifications, whereas in your proposal the wallet needs to upgrade to not get a diminished experience.
No, that's not correct, because They don't. No SPV wallets are currently requesting double spend, so nobody would get hurt. Also, it's not true that the only changes needed would be to ignore proofs. If you want them to use the proofs, they have to be able to process the proofs. So that change is needed. It doesn't exist right now.
So it does sound like there was a question about the engineering effort, which is why I wanted to stop you guys, right? It does sound like we're coming to the point where, you know, not counting nickel and diming lines of code, like we need, you know, a certain level of changes to all these, you know, to the same components within the Bitcoin network. SPV wallets, full nodes.
Someone who watches this video is going to notice I never responded about the 100K respend, which is a really good question. So you pay someone with a 2K transaction, and then you do a 100K respend. So it's a respend. It's not protected, but that's not important. It's only function in a respend relay scenario is to serve as an alert. And the reason that's not a big problem is because with an alert, you want it to go really fast. Or with a, sorry, because it's not the alert, it's also, if you're worried that a miner is going to mine it, you're worried that it's going to get to the miner fast, but it's not going to get to the miner fast. It's going to go very slow. So it's got a disadvantage.
Would that rely on security through obscurity in the sense that he could send the 100K transaction directly
well, it's
to the miner?
mitigating.
So to just go on that, I mean, that assumes that the path of the transaction to the miner and to the merchant is the same, right? Like it could be different so that the merchant doesn't see it, but the miner sees it. I think it's a dangerous assumption.
You're speaking, I'm not assuming a best case scenario for me. I'm just saying it's going to be, on average, 200 times slower.
So what about the scenario when the attacker sends the 200K transaction first, waits 5 seconds, and then finally sends the transaction to the merchant?
That's a big problem for your proposal, but not a problem at all in mine because we don't protect 100K transactions. That would not be relied on.
Why is it not a problem if you don't protect them?
Well, because the merchant would say, well, you didn't pay me with a super standard transaction, so I'm not giving you the goods until it confirms.
The second transaction is a super standard transaction.
That doesn't matter. That's not the one that pays the merchant.
The second transaction is the one that pays the merchant.
So so you're saying 5 seconds later, they do like a reverse respend kind of thing. But still, that's 5 seconds, but you have 50x times the other propagation.
That's hence you wait the 5 seconds, so all the miners already have it, and then in your proposal, you want the miners to replace it. That assumes that all the miners follow this policy, otherwise you will increase the ability of merchants to get robbed.
Maybe you can diagram it down.
Okay. Imagine we have a attacker that takes a 100K transaction, pays himself, and then he sends the transaction to the merchant, knowing that the transaction to the merchant is a much shorter path. So there's a good chance, it doesn't have to be 100% chance, that the transaction that he pays the merchant actually reaches the merchant. And it's a double spend, and the 100K transaction never reaches the merchant. And so your proposal also doesn't actually do anything about the relaying of the transaction in the first place. So it falls out of it, but it still is an open hole, isn't it? Did I miss something?
Okay, so
can I clarify for a sec? So you're saying the 100K transaction doesn't get to the merchant within the 5 second time window because it's so big. Is that what you're saying?
Well, also you're saying it doesn't pay the merchant, it's the respend.
Right.
Okay, so basically it's the same as the other scenario, but it's transmitted earlier. So basically you have the bad guy is trying to game it. He's trying to guess how much later it's going to arrive at the miner, and transmit it before that. Yeah, so he could try to do that. Yeah, he's trying to make a guess of those long time.
Does the efficiency of double spend proofs justify the engineering effort alone without even discussing these issues?
The engineering efforts, I mean, This is based on the creation of a hash that is going to be signed for a transaction. This is the basic, the core part of Bitcoin. This code is there. Might need to be refactored a little bit to make it reusable instead of copy-paste. I don't expect it to take a lot of time. And this goes for all implementations, because verifying signatures and the way that signatures are verified is that it takes it over a specific input, a specific output. There's rules for that based on the SIG hash, and those lines of codes are already there. So it really isn't a significant amount of work. Somebody just needs to sit down and do it, which is probably the actual writing of code is a much lower amount of work than the actual, creating of a new message in the network layer and that kind of details, which an SPV client doesn't even have to do.
I wanted just to, this discussion about double spend transactions and which one should be mined or which one shouldn't be mined. I think it's very important to stress that double spends don't happen by accident. They could potentially happen by some sort of bug in a wallet or something, but they're not by accident. They just doesn't happen by accident. And so I think a clearer way to view a double spend transaction is that they're both double spend transactions. They're both unwanted transactions. The double spend proof approach, why I like it, is it seems to be less invasive and less changing how things are running at the moment. It's a separate just notification, hey guys, something's going on. I'm not sure what relay of transaction adds that double spend of proof doesn't add. And to me, the real cost, and possibly we don't talk about it enough here, is there is a significant cost in my mind as to the perceived risk, as to the eventual result of further double spends occurring. And I think it's more complex than just social media exacerbates that perceived risk. But the end result is people lose, people perceive a risk, and that's it. I mean, that's why double spending is an issue, or zero confidence, because it's a perceived risk, even though it's not a major risk. It's almost good enough today, but there's this perceived risk, so everyone holds back. So anything that increases that, I think, has a significant effect in adoption, has a significant effect in development. Just in people looking to provide customer experience if there's more perceived risk around it. So that to me is the cost with the relay. And so I just wanted to...
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that, because the idea that it should be clear from what we've discussed today that addressing this area isn't just about the format of the alert. The format of the alert, I agreed, proofs can work. But just sending alerts is only a part of it. And that proposal, if it's simpler, it's because it has skipped over a bunch of things. It says, let's just protect all standard transactions. That's not a good idea. It doesn't address expiration. That's not okay. So we have to take all the ideas on the table. And so to say that it's simpler to do it, that's just because it doesn't do enough.
So what's missing from double spend proofs? Well, what risks or what notifications aren't covered in double spend proofs?
It's not clear when a UTXO becomes spendable again, unless you're going to permanently make that UTXO unspendable. That has to be addressed. Also, it tries to protect 100K transactions.
Why is it like a either or of these two? I don't understand that. Like,
it's not. I'm just responding to the idea that one's really simple. That's because it's oversimplified.
I don't get how double spend proofs has anything to do with expiration, because it doesn't change the way that existing transactions are relayed or mined. It's separate from the SPNP replacement rule. Double spend proof proposal is a whole other channel and layer, and yeah. So there's nothing to expire, really.
Right, but the person asking the question, I think, is assuming that just making a proof is the whole thing. And I'm not just, the proof itself is more complex. So,
I'll say from a notification point of view, what does relaying a transaction add? Because in my mind, notification is almost enough. This is how fast the merchant or the payment requester gets the notification. So my question
it's not. It's not almost enough.
So what does a relay provide that
Proofs.
proof doesn't? I agree that technically both can be achieved and technically complexities are the same.
Well, we're not talking, I told you that the format of the alert isn't the only difference. The two are very similar as alerts. It's the other parts of the protection that are important. I want to respond to the other question that was asked about, it was the answer that Tom gave about the effort. So he was saying that implementing proofs is no big deal. And so I'm not going to say that implementing relay is no big deal because it's obvious that it's no big deal and it's already implemented. I do think that it's far too easy to underestimate the effort involved in implementing something like proofs. It's complicated because it's a new message type and I had another slide that I didn't wind up showing, but today I put up a slide in Tokyo that showed there's 4 different ways you can get an ordering of TX1 and TX2 and what can happen in those scenarios. When you add the proof in there and you talk about what happens at the miner versus what happens at the merchant, there's 36 different combinations of orderings that can happen on both of them. And that doesn't mean you have 36 cases to solve. You try to come up with the rules, and there's some rules specified in the spec which say, if I get a proof and I've never heard of this UTXO before, I throw it away. I think there's some risk there actually, because if you throw it away, well, I'm not sure. But
so Tom, this is actually my question to Tom Zander, so maybe I can just segue into it. So to attempt to throw a monkey wrench into the works of double spend proofs, we've kind of agreed that it's much more efficient, right? So let's say an attacker was to create
slightly more efficient.
It's more the size of a transaction, the data passed can be much smaller, right? And it would therefore be relayed faster. So as an attacker, let's say I create 200K transactions, right? And effectively, and they're double spends of each other, and effectively then the double spend proof will beat those transactions propagating through the network and therefore be dropped due to this, this don't relay double spend proofs if you haven't seen the transaction yet rule, right? So I'm wondering, what is the source of that rule? I feel like you've created this high priority alert channel, but now you're chaining it to a low priority channel. Do you want to talk a little bit about why that was needed and how maybe we can solve this problem?
The basic reason why this was needed is simple. It's to protect from spam attacks, because when we provide a no questions asked high-level transport, we need to make sure that somebody can't abuse it. And the simplest way to avoid abusing a system is to make it have a cost. And the cost in this case is that there has to actually be a mineable transaction, which typically implies a cost, mining cost, for instance, or the fees specifically. So that's the reason why they are combined. And it's a good point. I think one of the reasons why we have these questions, I remember Almany had a fantastic question as well. What happens when you send hundreds of double spend transactions? So you have one actual transaction and then you just create 100 double spend transactions. And these are the kind of questions you get when you start implementing it. Where a simple thing that my idea about this is that a double spend proof that comes in will only need to be kept on a node for probably 10-20 seconds, because I expect like any mempool transaction that is in a mempool, I expect that we don't actually send the double spend proof unsolicited. We send an inf, which means that you have a round trip, because otherwise any node will get lots and lots of duplicates, lots of waste of bandwidth. So you need to cache it for some time anyway. And as a result, what you can do is you have a first level cache where you keep all of your double spend relays, and then you keep I have seen this ID of a double spend relay till the transaction is mined, something like that, and that sidesteps all of these problems. You don't relay. That's the rule. You do not relay a double spend proof until you have in your mempool one of the two transactions.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just thinking of a certain interesting scenario for the TX relay model, where the miners are behaving properly. They're doing first seen and they're replacing non-standard transactions and non-superstandard transactions by superstandard transactions, which is a requirement. But that gets a little bit weird if you have a block boundary. So if I go to a vending machine and I publish a non-standard transaction to a miner that accepts it, and I just wait until a block gets mined, then at that moment buy my stuff with a superstandard transaction, then the gap suddenly becomes the entire block. Isn't that a problem? Isn't that too large?
Well, the conflict that arrives, so the conflict will arrive as part of the block.
Yes, but then indeed it is self-propagation of the whole block that is basically becoming your gap.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought of that attack before. In general, you need to treat all the transactions that come in a block as if they've just been seen, and normally they would come later, because the block comes much later, so they wouldn't count as invalidating. But so your scenario is you wait for the block.
Yeah, exactly. And then the miner is behaving properly because he cannot, he has already done the non-standard transaction but hasn't seen the super standard one. And then, then suddenly your gap becomes quite large, I would say. But it only, of course, applies to situations where you can wait for the payment at an exact time, like a vending machine. But it's still an interesting scenario.
But can't you simply, like risk-wise, can't you simply model this by basically taking the ratio of block propagation time to 600 seconds and saying this is the kind of floor on the double spending avoidance I can do, and simply say, okay, there's a percent, it's probably less than a percent, it's a per mil chance that you have this block and you can actually exploit it. But I mean, if I look at the merchant and customer interaction, you're not going to wait at the checkout counter until the block arrives, right?
Oh, but you are not vending machine.
How does that question distinguish between these two proposals?
Well, with the double spend relay, of course the second transaction would just be relayed as a double spend anyway, even if it's already the first one is already in the block. Or am I? Yeah, it's still a double spend, right?
Maybe I don't have your scenario right.
Okay, so I'm publishing a non-standard transaction, and at the moment a block comes in, I'm publishing the superstandard transaction. So the superstandard, the miner is doing nothing wrong because he's including in a non-standard transaction without having seen the superstandard transaction. But in your proposal, you would have to wait for the entire block to come in order to see the non-standard transaction, the first one. Whereas in the other proposal, the double spend proof would just be sent immediately.
But isn't there almost the same attack? I mean, if you...
That's almost the same attack, but the difference is sending a double spend. In this case, the difference is not sending a double spend proof or a 100K transaction. The difference is sending a double spend proof or sending an entire block in terms of speed, in terms of the gap.
But you could just as easily double spend, regardless of what the plan is. If you're going to get the miner to put the respend in a block, and then you're going to immediately... processing the entire...
The notification time for the merchant, like the gap you said.
Once it gets to that transaction, but it has to process the whole block.
Yeah, the merchant has to process the whole block before he detects the double spend, instead of just receiving the double spend. So it's not a big time frame here, but it does increase the gap, I would say, for this scenario. And maybe it's an edge case, but
it's a good one. And this, I think, is the main reason why I would aim towards a separate system, a separate channel for notifications like these. Don't build it on top of an evolving system, because these kind of things, fantastic thinking. I'm pretty sure there's going to be more little gaps in the ideas of how these things work if you reuse the existing channels, because it's gonna. It's like a game system. A friend of mine worked for a game site, and whenever there was an update, there was a certain group of people that would always, spend a lot of time trying to find holes, and then, for the next week after it, you end up fixing all the little holes. And there's going to be unintended side effects, and it's going to be a continuous problem as long as you keep on using the existing channels, because any change to fix the problem will end up being inside of the system that you're trying to fix with unintended side effects.
People who are selling solutions that aren't created yet are always able to do that. And the assumption is that the new system won't have any problems. But the new system actually has all of its problems that haven't even been discovered yet, because it hasn't been written and it hasn't been used.
But at least they don't interact with each other.
Well, the idea of superstandard is actually a different channel. It is also asking what needs to be done to make it efficient. So it's not just reusing the existing channels.
Talking about standard, the one thing that I'm wondering about is, how do you foresee rollouts? Imagine that the miners over the course of 3 months will start introducing super standards as a replacement. When will it become safe for nodes to get for SPV nodes, for the SPV wallets, to get the double spend relays?
Well, what I said was that you have to treat the activation of the replacement rule similar to a hard fork. It has to be something that everyone agrees to turn that on at the same time. Okay. By turn it on, it means where wallets would say that this transaction is reliable.
Fair enough. I don't think that's a good idea, but that's not my decision to make.
Yeah, it's good just to understand the dimensions of each problem, right? And so looking on the other side, on the non-priority transactions, I find this proposal pretty interesting and completely new. I haven't heard of it before, these last talks. And of course, I have a few concerns. One would be, could an attacker just effectively completely spam the network with transactions that he know will likely not be committed until the mempool is full, right? And then the benefits of relaying non-priority go away, because now we have to start rejecting transactions from the mempool. Maybe, yeah, we can give imaginary username, Mike.
The idea of non-priority versus standard priority is not to say that nodes would have to start relaying non-priority now, because the realm of non-priority is big, and there will always be a threshold. No matter where you draw it, there will always be a threshold where a node starts to be unwilling to relay it. The idea is to draw a line between standard priority and non-priority, where above the line that is safe. Below the line, nodes, miners do whatever you want, just like they do today. Feel free to play with it, just don't affect things that are above that line.
But today, we just don't relay those transactions at all, right?
Well, some nodes and some miners do, and that has proven to be a problem.
So what you're saying is to clearly and in a centralized fashion define sort of when a transaction drops into the non-priority?
Well, I mean, the
today, non-relayed.
I mean, today we also draw that line. It was not followed by everyone. We also draw that line in terms of defining a min relay fee that is prevailing on the network. This proposal simply take that line and make it a more solid one that, you know, where one side would replace the other instead of just a rule where one side gets relay and one side doesn't. Because today we also have a default min relay rule that is min relay fee.
We have a default, which is effectively just a recommendation. It's not really.
Right, and that default line has actually made, you know, a lot of, it created some problems, but it also made a lot of difference in terms of making zero count more reliable. You know, like things that are below it, it tends to get blocked by the network and tends to not get mined.
So the non-priority proposal is to harden that line, at least by agreement, and then.
Yeah.
It's giving the option to the miners that basically, let's call it miner choice. Let's basically allow a miner to say, hey, I want to receive zero fee transactions and mine them. But they know that there's opposition to it because, you know, there's a risk to zero conf because the rest of the network doesn't. And you get into a situation where either everybody moves or nobody moves, and that's just not healthy. So where you now have the option for those miners that want to move the line to essentially say, okay, I'm going to make a separate layer of an NP transactions that allow you to, you accept it, but you do it in a way that doesn't cause abuse.
But so why do we need like this line at all when the double spend proof can handle those transactions as well?
Because they're not, the line, for instance, for the minimum fee is not in order to protect against a replay, the double spends. That's not the point. They are here to protect the network or protect
against
nodes
spam
specifically.
So
you call it spam, but yes, if there becomes zero fee, then you know it's easy to call them spam. Yes.
I understand. Yes.
In terms of addressing double spend, I just want to reiterate what was in my slide. They address two kinds of audiences. Like I agree that if everyone adopts double spend proof, then it will be fine, and the line is probably not needed. But separately, if miners draw that line and harden that line, then it protects wallets who do nothing at all. Wallets can just sit back, do nothing, and still get higher security. Today.
Yes, in double spend proofs, the whole NP concept is optional.
Yeah. While in double spend proof, you have to get a wallet that gets those alerts in order to benefit from it. Yeah.
So if we had to characterize, you know, out of all the proposals, which one would be the most permissionless? What do people think? And then maybe we can do a show of hands, and then they can argue it out. What do you think about that? So if you think double spend proofs, you know, enable more permissionless innovation, raise your hand.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, if you think that double spend proofs allow greater permissionless innovation, then raise your hand.
With respect to the...
With respect to the double spend relay.
And super standard. Like combined or
Yeah.
just relay?
Sure, combined. I mean, I don't... Tom,
Let's make that one optional, I'd say. Because, you know, that's for a later time.
So it seemed like maybe about 3/4
just
of
the
the people.
double spend, yes, exactly.
Yeah, so I'd like to point out it's not because... Yeah, there are, it's a 3-option question, at least, right?
Yes.
Because I did not vote yes, but if you were asking the opposite question, I would not vote no either. I think it has very little impact on...
It's a multi-dimensional problem, unfortunately. Yeah. I'm trying to simplify it, but yeah.
But let's ask the opposite then.
So Tom Harding, do you want to sort of respond to the fact that 75% of the people think that double spend proofs create more permissionless innovation?
No, I'd like to hear why.
Anyone in the audience want to state why? Or Tom Zander, do you want to go?
I think the
voted yes. You're asking your choice.
Yeah, you voted yes, so open your mouth.
okay.
So the main reasons for me are I like the idea of not having to have as many changes forced on a wallet to implement features. A wallet can choose not to accept the new double spend proof messages just fine. And it makes the standard behavior that they're doing today for most purchasing wallets just slightly more safe based on that original proposal with very few changes in the logic of the wallet. It also allows for the non-priority transactions to be treated very independently by the miners. And if those are going out, then they can choose how to relay what's happening there, but we can still provide the proofs in a very lightweight way to the wallets that choose to subscribe to those messages. So it gives more flexibility to me on how we handle non-priority transactions in the future. It gives some flexibility to the network to say, well, you know, these are non-priority, but these low maybe they have some other conditions that they say, well, these non-priority transactions I am going to relay to other parts of the network. And it gives them a choice to do that while giving us a way to give very small proofs that these double spends are occurring even in those cases. So I just see it as less complexity for the existing system, which means the people that have already developed solutions don't have to make that many modifications, meaning that the permissionless choices they made previously don't get impacted. And it allows for the more flexibility on the non-priority transactions without having to incur an additional size restriction for relaying that transaction. So since the double spend proofs are smaller, it allows us to distribute those faster and also cover the non-priority cases in a cleaner way, as if I'm reasoning about it correctly.
Okay, is that what you meant by permissionless? I mean, it's because I thought permissionless would mean allowing people to do more things without asking permission.
Yeah. So what I meant was, let's say you have a new service, you want to deploy it on the network. It requires, weird transactions, right? So can you just talk to XT and have, one node that supports that transaction type? Or do you need everyone to kind of acknowledge that transaction in lockstep?
Okay. I don't want to know what you said, but I think the relay it's way better for that because everyone knows how to process them already. So your point was, Josh's point was that it's easier to ignore because it's incremental. Proofs are easier to ignore.
It was more about the flexibility of non-priority transactions being treated very similarly when it comes to the proofs without having to worry about the additional size ramifications of the propagation time. So it allows for us to get that faster response while allowing flexibility for wallet authors to do more with non-priority transactions, which to me allows for permissionless innovation with more complex transactions.
Let's say, Tom H., let's say you had a transaction that you normally accept, and you have one that looks weird, and it's a double spend. Would you now relay the one that you normally wouldn't relay because it's a double spend, or would you just ignore it?
What does the spec say?
The spec says that they follow the same rules as the standard transactions. Yeah, but the idea is because the miners aren't going to treat them as protected.
So for me, the concept of permissionless innovation is that, if one miner says, hey, I'm going to work with this big bank and I'm going to make lots of transactions that completely fall within the consensus rules, but don't follow a standard, then that is one of the big, simple examples of permissionless innovation. Everybody will accept it, and It doesn't hurt anybody. The blocks get bigger, I guess, but that's about it. Double spend proofs basically don't hurt that. That's a very simple use case. I'm not saying that relays hurt the system either. It doesn't hurt permissionless innovation in practically all the use cases I come. And then this is probably the most extreme one I can come up with.
I have a question about something earlier, about what Tom Zandler, what you said about using also as a separate inf message the new double spends. I'm just trying to figure out a little bit how big these double spends can be. But I mean, I would say that that's about 4 or 5 infs, maybe max, a single double spend. It's really small. Does it really, yeah, maybe it's a bit of a technical detail, but does it really make sense to
it's the same level as normal transactions. We don't get very big either, where essentially what you want to do is if you have one node that connects to 8 or even 100 nodes, then you don't want to make that one node send the full data to all of those, because if that one node itself is also connected to 100 nodes, it would get 100 duplicates.
Yes,
whereas if it only gets an inf, then it might get 100 inf duplicates, but it doesn't matter too much.
Yeah, that depends, of course, on how big it is compared to an inf. That's
it's definitely bigger.
It is definitely bigger, but it's also bigger to send both an inf and setting an additional inf and an additional round trip. Maybe well, it may be a consideration. I don't know. I don't know if you.
This is the original design in Bitcoin, and it's actually used quite a lot in the industry because, you know, if you have 100 of them, you save the difference in them times 99. So it is definitely a benefit.
I don't see why, Josh, why you see such a big difference in wallet developers' experience. That you had 2 major things. One was that you said the proofs would be easy to support, and once they decided to, but they didn't have to. And the other was that you see an advantage of the service that miners can provide with the SP replacement. The second point, I agree with that, and I think that should be done. I think it's an element of that proposal that it's just a good idea. And I don't see how you can be so sure that implementing the proofs is going to be easier. It seems to me like it's not going to be easier for the wallet. And as I said before, I think all things considered, let's just say it's about equal.
I like to point out a couple of things. So first of all, I think that we should actually maybe not talk too much about double spending transactions. I mean, like a transaction is being double spent as a result of being an input being double spent, right? And I think we should focus on this, like actually you're double spending inputs. This is what's happening, right? Like the transaction is double spending because it's like an atomic set of inputs being double spent. Like, but actually what happens is the input. And the other thing is that on the spam case, that actually got me thinking, and I think I touched this area a couple times when I was thinking about this, like whether it's double spend relay or whether it's a transaction relay or a proof relay. In either case, it strongly depends on the other part that you brought up, Tom. That is Tom Harding. I mean, that is like what is a super standard, or whether we have a super standard transaction and whether they actually enter the mempool or not, because that depends on. Like the propagation of the proof or the propagation of the relay depends a lot on the rules we make for actually accepting it into the mempool. So it seems to me like you cannot even separate these two cleanly.
So to just address the point, the main reason that I feel like it's slightly more permissionless is the treatment of the non-priority transactions and still being able to provide proofs for those transactions to give flexibility to people that want to create more complex transaction types. The wallet integration issue is a very minor one, and honestly, I don't think there's a huge difference. I think it's a slight difference. And I'm still very cautious about the idea of replacement transactions. I'm not completely sold that replacement transactions are the correct way, other than just notifying that there is 2 transactions that are happening a certain way. With transaction relays, we can relay that transaction, but if it's based off of the existing mempool rules, then a lot of nodes are not going to see both the standard and the non-priority transaction relayed, because the non-priority transactions by default are not generally relayed. So it creates this slight gap that the proof fills in a unique way, because now we can provide the proofs on those non-priority transactions and still not worry about the high bandwidth thresholds that would happen because those non-priority transactions may have extremely extensive scripts or do something slightly different.
Okay, so I think I get it. You're saying this is the argument that with a proof system, this opens up the possibility that non-standard transactions can be freely relayed. Things that are currently non-standard.
They can choose to relay them on their own merit. So if a miner decides that, oh, well, this isn't a standard transaction, but I think that this is reasonable enough that I am going to relay it, the proofs allow for that flexibility for those types of transactions.
I don't exactly see how the proofs allow that. And also the reasons why that's not done don't have anything to do with, have no more to do with double spending or zero conf than relaying standard transactions. The reasons, like, I think the reason we don't relay 1 megabyte non-standard transactions is because nobody's really worked on what happens when you have a mix of lots of 250 byte transactions and also a lot of megabyte transactions.
I agree, but permissionless...
Maybe it works fine, but I think that's why we have
means they are allowed to try. And if we're not going to relay the non-priority transaction, then there's nodes that are not going to see both. They're only going to see the standard transaction. They're going to have no evidence that this double spend actually occurred until a block possibly lands that has this non-priority transaction in it, since it is not going to relay both. With the proof, we can reliably prove that this non-priority transaction actually had a conflict and actually relay that proof without worrying about the burden of the non-priority transaction being super large.
Well, but everybody's going to have the proof generation, so they have to parse through it before they create the proof. So they have a chance of seeing it.
The final caveat, though, which, as Tom Harding said, is interesting because it's the devil we don't know, is if we relay the double spend proofs, right? And perhaps we don't because we're worried about spam, right? And where is that exact line going to fall where we're relaying non-priority double spend proofs, and how much spam can we generate?
This is where I like Omni's thought process on this, is that it's about a double spent input. So if I only have, all I need is to provide one proof that I saw 2 of that input. I don't care if there was 42 of that input. I need one proof that I saw it twice. And that's all I need, and the bandwidth requirements are extremely low. So I definitely like his thought process there, where it's really about the input being double spent. It's not about the fact that there was 2 double spend transactions. It's that 2 transactions shared an input.
Yeah, just to add on that, like my last one, I don't know whether it got across so well because. So I don't know whether my last comment got across so well.
Ask a question.
Yeah, right, but I just want to, I actually want to add a comment here, but like just what you said, like the input, right, but we have to make sure that, like what Tom Zander said, that there is the spam risk isn't exacerbated because there is, now we have a very cheap transaction and that creates a double spend, right? So this is why I think that we have to make sure that that these double spend proofs are not cheap to generate because we have some set of transactions now that are too cheap.
Sounds like we exhausted this debate.
And to follow up on the original question of does it hurt permissionless innovation, and I think we kind of came to a consensus here. It does help permissionless innovation. I think double spend proofs help permissionless innovation because we will always see weird things coming up that we haven't seen yet. And you know, the changing of policies, the ideas of what kind of transactions are standard will most likely change over the next couple of years as more people, more businesses enter this space. And that should be allowed, where double spend proofs essentially just don't mind, because it's just about the inputs that get double spent. That's it.
Well, I'm against innovation and don't want anybody new coming into the space.
I guess that wraps it up
It does, for sure.
Thank you, guys.